Hello, welcome in, everybody. Thank you, thank you. Before we get started, I'm going to just post a link in the chat. Please complete this short anonymous demographic survey. It helps the Q Corner continue educational chats like this one. And we're very, very excited for this brand new topic to talk about, especially during Dalit History Month. We're here to talk about caste. It's an anti-caste workshop. It's a 101. I'm Keen. I use they, them pronouns. I'm caste privileged, and I am here to introduce an incredible educator and activist in the community. Manu Kaur is a Dalit, non-binary queer femme who curated a multimedia Dalit art exhibition and dance party titled Dalit Dreamlands Towards an Anti-Caste Future, which brought together artists from various caste-oppressed communities. Manu envisions Dalit Dreamlands as an annual event to bring together a community that is committed to anti-caste futures. They hope this will create dialogue and make spaces more safe and inclusive for caste-oppressed folks, particularly Dalit, queer, and trans artists. And for the sake of this chat, just a little bit more information. We're not going to have the chat activated for tonight, but you are more than welcome to post questions in the Q&A. And Manu's going to go through their presentation and answer questions at the end. We'll have plenty of time for that. So yeah, without further ado, Manu, please take it away.
Thank you, Keen. Hi, everyone. I appreciate you taking the time to attend this presentation. I'm grateful for the Q Corner for giving me this platform. I will be sharing this in like a PowerPoint presentation style, but please go ahead and send your questions as I go through the presentation, and then we'll go over them in the end. So I'm just going to share my PowerPoint. Okay. Is that good to go? Hope everything's okay. Awesome. Okay. So throughout the slides, there's going to be a lot of art. I did try to link the artist of each illustration that I have on the slide. So I encourage y'all to follow those artists and support them. Okay, so before I really get into the presentation, I just wanted to go over some, I guess, disclaimers or just like things to discuss beforehand. Today's like anti-caste lens can be applied to all fields. So, this anti-caste lens, it exists in all aspects and all realms of our lives. I will be focusing kind of like on like cultural and art lens, but this can be applied broadly. I'm not a spokesperson for all caste oppressed people. I'm here to share my knowledge and my personal lived experiences and the lived experiences of folks close to me. And so, I don't think it's fair to put anyone in that, position that they have to represent an incredibly diverse oppressed community. And so, there might be things that I say today that other Dalit folks might not agree with, or it might not be true for them. So I just like to remind folks to not put me on that pedestal. We're human, we make mistakes. I may share things today that maybe I will feel differently. I'm constantly learning and unlearning. And like this anti-caste lens is like a lifelong process of learning. I also wanted to be upfront that not all caste oppressed people actually identify with the term Dalit. Some folks don't use that term. It can also be a very like academic term, so it's not always accessible for all folks. Some folks identify as Ambedkarites because we follow Dr. Ambedkar, who really, was the one who led this anti-caste revolution. He's the reason why Dalit folks even have rights. And so a lot of folks identify as Ambedkarite, or they might identify with their specific caste, like category or name. And so just wanted to be upfront that not all folks resonate with the term Dalit. And then again, there's no one face of the current movement. There are so many different Dalit leaders. And I encourage you all to really learn from as many as you can, learn all the different aspects and perspectives. And then don't let anti-caste practices become a fad. I'm very grateful that caste is finally being a topic that's kind of being talked about way more now than even when I first started talking about it. It was met with a lot of defensiveness and dismissiveness. So it's nice to know that I think that folks are wanting to learn about caste and they're wanting to engage and like really, talk about the discrimination that comes around casteism. And so I just ask that folks continue to do that and don't let it just become like a hot topic. Okay, so what is caste? So this is the definition that I just took from Google that I wanted to read out loud. So here it defines caste as each of the hereditary classes of Hindu society distinguished by relative degrees of ritual purity or pollution and of social status. Okay, so it's basically this hierarchy and based on like what you're born into, that determines where you fall under this caste system. And even though it says here specifically Hindu society, it also exists in, it's like an interfaith, inner like cultural issues. Like it also exists in Sikhi, which is my background. Sikhi is a religion. It also exists in Islam. A lot of, issues around caste exist amongst like Dalit Christian communities as well. And so it is something that has permeated beyond just like Hinduism. Um, so this pyramid kind of like helps you to like really learn some of these terms. And so this is like what is considered India's caste system. So you see a pyramid and you see the first at the top are Brahmins. So that's one caste category. They're supposed to be like at the top. They're the highest in privilege. And then under them are Kshatriyas, then Vaishyas, then Shudras. And then notice how at the bottom there's Adivasis and Dalits. Adivasis are basically indigenous to the land. And so there tend to be like tribal communities that are basically treated as Dalit folks are treated. And then, Dalit folks and Adivasis are considered outside of the pyramid. So even though right now you see that as part of this pyramid, they're considered outside of the caste system. So the caste system is supposed to be this like 4-level Brahmin, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, Shudras. And then outside of that, like is the lowest of the low. And so, Dalit people were formerly known as untouchables. And that kind of relates to this idea of ritual purity, that even like Dalit people were considered so polluted that if like someone of a higher caste even came in like contact, that they would be polluted or somehow they would get like the dirt or whatever it is that is associated with someone that they deem is less than essentially. And so oftentimes if like a Dalit person touches or even uses a dish or even enters a space that is occupied by someone of a higher caste, it's considered polluted. Like they will clean it, they will, there's a lot of like violence that happens. And so this is a very discriminatory system that essentially treats Adivasi Dalit folks as less than, and it is a system that is still being upheld even today. A lot of folks might argue that this is something that was in the past. Some folks might say, oh, this came about when the British occupied India. But I just want to, share that this is a system that has been created and ongoing for many, 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 centuries or years. And so it's not anything that's just recently created or created by like the British. This is something that has very violent origins and it still exists today. It may look different, but it absolutely still exists today. And so I'll get a little bit into that. Okay. So how is caste determined? So like, how do you know what someone's caste is? Caste and race are like very parallel systems. They're not identical, but they can function in similar ways. But one of the main differences is that, with race, like you can see race in terms of like how someone looks physically, but with caste, there's not necessarily some kind of like physical marker. Um, so basically how people know what someone's caste is based on their surname. And so this is like their last name that they use, their family's name, and their family's name like shows what their caste is. And so, you can tell a lot of what category someone falls in based on their last name. And so that's why in Sikhi, we were told to kind of change our last name to Kaur or Singh, basically in the hopes that like if we all have the same surname, then there's no way to like identify our last names with specific castes because we're all the same last names. And this unfortunately, like a lot of folks don't abide by that, especially in Sikhi, like they'll still use their caste last name. Essentially is like a pride thing. Many folks are very proud of their last names, especially if it holds a lot of caste privilege. In fact, like you might even see like license plates with people's like caste privilege last names or businesses named after it. And so a lot of folks have that caste pride. You can also tell based on region of birth and residence. Some of the regions, like especially in villages, they're like segregated based on your caste. And so like you can tell what caste someone is based on exactly where they live. And so sometimes when people are asking like, what's your last name? Or, where specifically are you from in India? Sometimes those are ways to like learn what someone's caste background is without directly asking what the caste they're from. And so with the surname, I use Kaur and my family that's like the name that we all use. And I didn't know what my actual like last name is, my family's like surname, which is Bunger. And I didn't find that out until my adult like life. And so, this was something that was intentionally hidden, that my family chose not to use our actual surname because they were worried about facing caste discrimination based on the last name that we have. And so they chose to use Kaur and Singh as a way to not let folks know what caste we're from. But I still get questions from people like, if I tell them my name is like Manu Kaur, especially if they're Punjabi, they'll ask like, what's your real last name? And that question is literally the same as asking, so what caste are you? And so those are some ways that caste gets determined. Social class also, like the identity, oftentimes folks who are caste oppressed are also in poverty. They're also considered working class or low class. And then usually caste privileged people, especially Brahmins, tend to have a lot of wealth, especially intergenerational wealth. And so sometimes you can kind of tell caste based on like the wealth that someone's family comes from. And this isn't to say that, there aren't like rich Dalit people or there aren't poor like caste privileged people. This is more of like a pattern that is seen often. And then occupation, if I go back, so the pyramid that I shared earlier, basically there's like a specific occupation that's listed with each group. So like for Brahmins, it was priests. So they're like the priests, and that's supposed to be like the highest occupation that someone can have. And then Kshatriyas are like warriors or fighters, and then Vaishyas are like merchants or traders. Shudras are considered like peasants or doing like manual labor. Dalit folks are supposed to, the occupation is like to do basically what is considered like the dirtiest of work. Whether it's like manual scavenging, whether it's cleaning other people's garbage, sewers, things like that. That's like what the people are expected to work in. And like they're supposed to be like stuck in that occupation. And so that's one way that caste can be determined based on like what job someone does. And then social customs, traditions, and even worship can tell what someone's caste is. Like, for example, what traditions or holidays they follow, what kind of things they worship, intergenerational wealth, as I mentioned. Even diet can determine what someone's caste is. And so a lot of times, like caste privileged people, especially Brahmins, are vegetarian. And you might like see restaurants, especially recently, I've been seeing a lot of restaurants that will say like pure vegetarian. And this like term, it's really very caste coded because there's this idea around like people who are caste oppressed are supposed to like be the ones who are eating meat, and that's considered like dirty or impure. And so essentially they're saying that vegetarians are the ones who are caste privileged, and that eating meat is like, considered this like lowly thing that is associated with being Dalit or caste oppressed. So caste permeates diet too. And then there are like, certain racial features or discrimination. For example, there are stereotypes that Dalit people are darker skinned or they have certain facial, like bigger noses or like curly or bigger hair, things like that. Just very like basically racial discrimination, and that exists even within like the Dalit community as well, this like anti-blackness, that also folks kind of associate with caste. And then even language and dialect, and educational background. A lot of like Dalit people and people who are caste oppressed don't have the same educational opportunities or access, and so people determine someone's caste based on like what's their educational background and also even how they speak. Can they speak English? All of these things are like supposed to help someone determine what caste is. There's many other ways as well, but I share this just to like share how many like insidious ways like caste can show up. Okay, so caste permeates every aspect of life. So I already talked about like wealth and food and diet, even access to spaces like physical spaces. A lot of Dalit people are not allowed in certain places of worship, they're not allowed in certain homes, or like some people, if they know that someone's Dalit, they ask them to like wait outside or stand outside. It's like this deep segregation and discrimination based on like what spaces people can access. Resources and networking, a lot of Dalit people don't have those supportive systems. And it's because they're actively, like it's very intentional that they're not allowed access to those spaces or those networks. Social media as well, a lot of casteism shows up in social media, whether it's, targeting people who are talking openly about caste on social media platforms, or whether it's posting certain kind of materials, or like, there's like a lot of even content creators who are caste privileged, who can post very ignorant things that show like their caste privilege and also just like their caste ignorance. Even like South Asian parties or events, caste can show up. Caste can determine like whether someone is invited to a wedding or a get together. Dating is also a main way that caste kind of shows up, is that there's this like practice of endogamy where like you are supposed to marry within your same caste. And if you have like an intercaste relationship, it's met with a lot of violence. And it's usually the person who's caste oppressed who has to deal with most of the violence. So a lot of people have been, hurt or murdered even, for trying to marry someone outside of their caste. It shows up in friendships. Some people won't like want to be friends with someone just because they're of a lower caste or they're caste oppressed. It shows up in music, especially in Punjabi music. There's a lot of caste pride that is almost in every song. Like even songs that are coming out now in 2025 have a lot of caste pride in them. They also have a lot of anti-blackness, fat phobia, and it's all just like interconnected. And even in like dance, especially classical Indian dance, there's a strong history of casteism and how that has basically, excluded spaces that were even created by those folks. And before I keep like going, I also wanted to say that, some content warnings is that I will be talking about sexual violence, murder, rape, and so I encourage y'all, like, if you're not in a space to, listen to those that information, I'd encourage you to take a break. You can leave and come back, you can mute, whatever helps. I just want to be upfront about that content warning. And so specifically about this slide. So examples of casteism. So, there's like many different ways that caste shows up, but one of the main ways um, is caste violence, has to do with gender-based violence, specifically with sexual violence. And it's obviously it's used as a form of control. And so oftentimes caste privileged men will rape or kill or both Dalit women, because that is like considered the ultimate like violent form of control. And an example of that is the Hathras rape case, which, was basically it went viral worldwide. It was a terrible, terrible event where a Dalit girl was basically raped and eventually died from the rape. And like it was on a bus and it was public, and no one did anything about it. And when it first came out, there was a lot of wanting to just like hide it or basically not hold the people who did it accountable. And that happens a lot where even the police, tend to be very casteist. And so if it is a Dalit victim, they tend to not want to investigate it, or they even get bribed by like the people who are exhibiting the violence. And so, sometimes it doesn't even get investigated. And so this case did, because of how much of an outcry there was finally some accountability. But this is just one example of how sexual violence and sexual exploitation is one of the main ways that, casteism is exhibited. Another one that's closer to folks who are in so-called Bay Area, specifically in Berkeley, was the Lucky Reddy Bali Reddy sex trafficking. So this man he's a landlord, he owned a lot of buildings that are providing housing in Berkeley, and they're still owned by his family, like many of them. So if you are renting out a building in so-called Berkeley, like there is a chance that it is owned by this family. But basically, he was getting Dalit girls and women from India, and he was basically sex trafficking them, like bringing them here, hiding them, putting them in extremely bad conditions. And the way that he was caught was because one of the girls was basically died from these being in the situation, and he was caught trying to like hide the body essentially. And so, this would not have been exposed if it wasn't, for him basically like making a mistake. But, so many people would have known about this in order for it to occur, especially like members of his family. And because they have this like high caste, they didn't see like Dalit girls or women as human. And it's very telling that they specifically targeted Dalit people. They didn't like sex traffic like women from their own caste or other castes. And it just shows how insidious casteism is. Another recent example is of manual labor exploitation. There was a case in New Jersey where there was a temple that was using forced manual labor of Dalit people to build this temple. And it wasn't caught until like there was an investigation, especially with the FBI, and that's how it was exposed. And so, this happened maybe like a couple of years ago. So this is very new. And then also work discrimination. There's many places where it shows up even here. One example is there's a tech company called Cisco, and they are being sued by a caste oppressed person who basically wasn't given promotions or given the same kind of resources from their bosses because of their caste, because they knew their caste. And so they saw other folks who were more caste privileged, getting these promotions and being treated differently. And so that is a case that was filed as well. So all of these are examples of casteism, and these are very close to home. Some folks might want to say that casteism is something that only happens in India, or it's from the past, but these are very recent examples. And so with that, I specifically wanted to talk about the intersection of caste and queerness. So I'm holding this sign, which I'll read, but basically I had this project where I wanted caste oppressed folks to write signs that basically is like telling the public how casteism has shown up for them and like how casteism has affected them. And so for me, I wrote casteism shows up for me in the diaspora when I try to connect with South Asian queers, but caste power dynamics become a dividing factor. I feel too queer and non-binary for the Dalit community, but too Dalit for the South Asian queer diaspora. I crave connection and safety, but where do I find it? Where are the queer Dalit safe spaces? And so that for me has been a very difficult journey. I tend to not feel like I fit in, especially in a lot of South Asian spaces. And so I've really been like very hungry for spaces where I feel seen and I feel heard. And so the way that I've seen casteism show up in queer spaces, specifically those that are dominated by South Asian queers, there's this like co-opting of oppression. So what I mean by that is that oftentimes South Asians who are queer will kind of compare like their oppression to Dalit folks, especially to Dalit queer folks. Because, of course, like people can be oppressed for their sexual orientation and gender identity, but it sometimes tends to become like this comparison of traumas or oppressions. And I think it's important to acknowledge that Dalit queer folks tend to be even multiply marginalized. And so that is something that's not acknowledged in these kind of spaces. Everyone's kind of considered to be like this equal, like because of queerness, they are oppressed. But the intersection of caste and queerness tends to not be talked about. And then a lot of events and parties and, workshops that are done, I've seen often, they're basically created by caste privileged queers for caste privileged queers. A lot of the events that I've been to, there's, it's clear that it's not a anti-caste space because there's a lot of like wealth ignorance. For example, these events might not be affordable, or even music and artist selection. A lot of these spaces will use music that has caste pride, or they'll play artists who are actively known to being casteist. And there's also, of course, like the lack of dialogue and accountability. I have also had experiences of trying to, have these conversations with some of these networks that do have events, and it's often met with silencing and also just kind of like, I either don't get any kind of response or I'll get a response like, well, I don't really care about that, or I don't want to be political. I think it's important to acknowledge that any queer space will be political. And so even if it's, even if it's like a party or some kind of event, it's political. And so I do think that it's very important to, acknowledge all of the different identities and the dynamics that exist. And another, way I've seen casteism in queer spaces is like reinforcing casteist traditions. Sometimes, especially being South Asian queer, you want to have some kind of hold on like on your culture, especially because oftentimes, we feel maybe disconnected from our culture because of our queerness. But unfortunately, sometimes that ends up leading to celebrating these traditions or holidays that are actually very casteist. But it's also a way of like holding on to culture. And so I think that there needs to be some more research around like what exactly are we celebrating? Where does this tradition come from? Is this oppressing a different like subgroup of South Asian queers? So I just like think that those are kind of some important things to think about and talk about, especially in queer spaces that are predominantly South Asians. And then for safe spaces for caste oppressed queers. Um, so one thing that I think would be really helpful to create a safe space is to include caste in like rhetoric around identity and kind of normalizing caste as a term. I know that for some of you folks, like this might be the first time you're learning about caste, like what is caste? Hopefully you have some kind of idea about it now. But something that I'd love to see is just like caste being, one of the things that we discuss when it comes to oppressed identities. Like there's race, there's gender. I hope that caste can also be included in that group, just because oftentimes Dalit people feel, we're just put into this subgroup of like South Asians. And not acknowledging caste is essentially erasing a lot of the oppression that isn't seen. Also like training and education. So, shout out to Q Corner for, hosting this. I think ways like this, having workshops, can kind of like create the safe space. Like, for example, someone might attend this who is caste oppressed, and that might like help them to feel more comfortable and feel like Q Corner, is a safe space, is a space that cares about caste oppressed queers. And so I think offering those kind of resources, also offering opportunities and grants, as I mentioned, wealth and like poverty tend to be this reoccurring thing. And oftentimes like Dalit people don't have opportunities to create, whether it's like a research project or an art project. And a lot of that has to do with like lack of funds or lack of mentorship. And so I think if organizations or spaces can, create these opportunities, create these grants that are specifically meant for caste oppressed people to apply and get, I think that can really allow Dalit people to enter spaces that they otherwise might not have the opportunity to. Fundraising is also a way to kind of create safety. Like oftentimes a lot of Dalit queer people struggle financially. And so I've helped fundraise for folks who are in that community. And, I think that a lot of organizations can do fundraising for Dalit queer people, whether it's for a specific person or an organization that works with Dalit folks. I think that that can also be a great way of showing solidarity. I also added support groups. So I did attend a support group that was for Dalit feminists, and it was a very caring and safe space. One thing that was missing from it was that it didn't really acknowledge gender identity or queerness. And so, like I kind of was misgendered a lot, or, it felt like a very cishet space. And so even though I felt supported in terms of like my Dalitness, it didn't fully feel safe because it didn't acknowledge the intersecting identities. And so I think to create safe spaces, to create like support groups that are created by and led by Dalit queer people can be a great source of healing. And I haven't really been able to find a support group that focuses on caste. And so I think this would be a great opportunity for folks to make that happen, whether it's to find, Dalit therapists or counselors or setting up a network. I think that would be a really great way to create a safe space. And then also events that are centering caste oppressed queers. Again, it doesn't have to be educational, it doesn't have to be like workshops. It could be fun things as well. It just like there's so many different ways to talk about caste. And so I believe that having events where there's interaction and people can attend and, mingle. I think it can also be a great way to center these identities. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Dalit Dreamlands. So I was able to get a grant from the Asian American Women Artists Association, AWA, and they're located in so-called Oakland. And they basically had this scholarship that you can apply to, and it was for their curatorial program. And so I was able to get that. And only because of that, scholarship, I was able to create this Dalit Dreamlands. I'm going to read a little bit of the curatorial statement, but basically Dalit Dreamlands is towards an anti-caste future. It was a multimedia Dalit art exhibition and dance party that brought together 40 multiply marginalized artists from Dalit, Adivasi, Bahujan, Afro-Indian, Indo-Caribbean, Indo-Fijian, and Muslim communities to showcase the depths of creativity and community. Dalit Dreamlands, supported through AWA's Emerging Curators Program, will center queer and trans caste abolitionist futurisms through art across various mediums, including fashion, design, music, performance, films, paintings, and visuals. And so I basically put together this art exhibition and dance party. And I had as many exhibiting artists as I could, and they all came from different oppressed backgrounds, whether they were Dalit folks or Adivasi. And I just really wanted to create an intentional space that centered Dalit queer folks, especially. And I wouldn't be able to do this again if I didn't get this opportunity from AWA. And most of the folks who run AWA are East Asian. And so they're not specifically South Asian. And so I think that it's also interesting that I was able to get this opportunity not from like a South Asian org. And I think that there is like a deficit there. I do feel like a lot of South Asian orgs, when they do focus on caste, it tends to be about, promoting like educational things or like having someone do a talk. And I feel like there isn't as much focus on like, who are Dalit people outside of activism? Who are Dalit people outside of just educating people about caste? Dalit people are artists, they have like other talents. And I think it's important to create opportunities for them to showcase their talents. And so Dalit Dreamlands was a very healing opportunity for me to kind of, focus more on like art and healing instead of constantly engaging in activism. Because, even though like educating and political organizing is very important to me, it has also been a very violent space for me. Like, I've been doxxed and I get threats and things like that. And so being able to focus on something that was more centered around healing was like a great experience for me. And so I just think that being able to create more of those opportunities for Dalit people is an amazing way to show solidarity. And if you did attend Dalit Dreamlands, I hope that you had an amazing experience. This is an art exhibition that I would like to see happen again. It doesn't have to happen in so-called, Bay Area. I'd love to see it in the East Coast or in another country. I just think that this isn't unique to me. I think that something like Dalit Dreamlands can exist and be created by many different people, and all it takes is the resources, the financial support, and like, having really good mentors as well. And so I would love to see, things like this that are intentionally creating healing spaces for Dalit queer people. And then these are just some pictures from the exhibition itself. These are folks attending and looking at all the different art. In the middle, there was this photo project, basically where it was for, Dalit queer folks, folks from Adivasi communities, or even Indo-Caribbean communities, to, you know, like if they wanted to submit a portrait of themselves, to kind of showcase, you know, it's one thing about being from these oppressed communities is that we often feel ashamed. We're often shamed for how we look or how we are portrayed. And I really wanted to create a project that showed us in this like empowering kind of like, you know, like being displayed as art, and being able to like see themselves on these walls as art. I think that that is really powerful in itself. And so also, you know, there were other incredible artists, portraits, paintings. There's a, on the right, there was this poem called Untouchable. And it was written by this incredible Dalit poet, who basically, you know, showed a lot of vulnerability, by showcasing this, but it was vulnerability that to them felt like very safe. And it didn't feel like trauma porn or like with their traumas just on display. It felt like a healing experience for them. And so I think that's really important as well when, you know, we are organizing events like this, is that we want it to feel empowering, to the artist, to the folks who are getting these opportunities, because sometimes, especially in anti-caste spaces, there's just a lot of trauma porn, trauma dumping that like folks are shown in like, you know, really terrible situations. And so I think it's also important to uplift and show like Dalit folks in like, you know, like more like ways of like they're healing, they're happy, they're enjoying, like centering joy, I think is also really important. And so these are photos from the dance party that we had, after the art exhibition. And so this was just for me personally an incredible experience because it was so awesome to see all of these different folks, you know, dancing and experiencing joy, and also still like showing up, for the queer people, showing up, you know, for anti-caste politics. You know, I don't think that those need to be separate. And so, some of the ways that, you know, folks can show up is, of course, wealth redistribution. Like, you know, if you have intergenerational wealth, to distribute it to, you know, caste oppressed folks, whether it's specific individuals or whether it's organizations. I think it's an important way to show up. But of course, it's not everything. I think that it's also important to basically really commit to learning and unlearning. There's just so much about caste that shows up, and there's so much to learn about it. And I think it's not enough to just give a donation or, you know, like sponsor something. I think that it's also important to understand that it's a lifelong practice of learning. Also, you know, a lot of Dalit folks, you know, like a one-time sponsorship isn't enough. Some folks need even like monthly financial support. And so I think it's important to show up with redistribution of wealth in ways that actually can meet the needs of like the Dalit communities. The path to being anti-caste is meant to be uncomfortable and difficult. I think that, you know, when we have privilege, sometimes we don't realize that how much we're benefiting from that privilege. And so a lot of, you know, like a lot of being anti-caste is like letting go of some of that privilege. And that's not like, you know, of course that's like hard. Like it's hard to let go of opportunities that you feel like you may deserve. But it's important. It's important to, you know, like to, even if you have to risk your own access to certain privileges, it's important to do that, to show up, whether it's, you know, calling out family members, or whether it's cutting out family members who are extremely casteist, and not receiving, you know, financial support from them. It's things like that to show up. And, you know, of course, don't talk for us, give us the platform. I say silently just because I think sometimes, you know, especially with caste privilege folks, They want to feel like rewarded for showing up as anti-caste. And it's like, it shows up a lot in different communities that are privileged. It's like you want to feel good about yourself because you're showing up for an oppressed group. And I think it's important to not making it about you. I think it's important to just give that platform without having to like tell the world that that's what you're doing. Be upfront about caste privilege. One of the ways that I've encouraged folks is to basically like if we are doing talks or if we are engaging in like a predominantly South Asian community is just like, just like how we introduce our names and our pronouns. I think it's okay to also be upfront about your caste privilege. Like you don't have to say your specific caste, but you could say like, I'm caste privileged or I'm caste oppressed. I think that sharing these identities also normalizes it and makes it, like less of this abstract like topic that we shouldn't talk about. And I also encourage folks to even write their caste privilege like in their like Instagram bios, things like that, because especially for me, it's really helpful to know who I'm engaging with and where they're coming from. I engage with caste privileged people in a very different way compared to how I engage with people who are Dalit. And sometimes it can feel very difficult to engage with someone who isn't upfront about their caste privilege. Sometimes they are co-opting anger that isn't theirs to hold. And so it's just really helpful to be upfront about it. I also encourage folks to prioritize and, encourage caste oppressed people for opportunities again that are beyond just like educational talks and workshops, giving them opportunities if they have like a vision, whether it's, a fashion show, whether it's a film they want to make. I think it's really important to also encourage folks to have like, access to those kind of projects. And then of course, like challenging stereotypes assigned to Dalit and Adivasi people. If you hear these different stereotypes, it's important to call them out. It's important to, even if it feels scary, even if it means that you might be dismissed or, that you might feel like people don't like you anymore. I think it's important to call it out as you see it. And even if you're not sure, like if it is a casteist, stereotype or situation, I think it's important to like be curious about it, to like, what does it mean? Where is it coming from? I think it's important for us to really ask questions about like some of the terms we use or some of the like cultural norms that we have. And then, so it's like beyond allyship. I don't like saying like a caste like ally, like anti-caste ally. I prefer to say caste traitor, which is a term I really like that I learned about a while ago. And so I also really like these slides from Smashboard. They're the Instagram account. And it kind of like summarizes what I've already been saying. These are some of the ways that you can show up, as a caste trader. And these apply to both like South Asian folks and also non-South Asian folks, For example, like if you do have caste privilege, to speak out and act against casteism in your family, among your friends and colleagues. But also like if you, are not South Asian, I think it's also important to educate yourself so that you can speak out and you can like identify if something is casteist or if, someone is being oppressed, like whether it's in the workplace or whether it's in some kind of group or an event. I think the more you can educate yourself, the more you can identify it. Also listen actively to Dalit feminists, respond with love and solidarity. I have linked just a few Instagram accounts of Dalit feminists that, I really look up to. And I encourage you all, if you don't know where to start or who to learn from, these are some great platforms to engage with. And you can also learn about some more through them as well. So amplify the voices, especially those that have informed or inspired you. You know, um, it's meant to be uncomfortable. If you feel uncomfortable when there are conversations around caste, that means that, you know, you are doing the difficult work. And so it is important to amplify and listen. And so yeah, this is a performance that was created during the Adult Dreamlands dance party. And you know, it's just showing a lot of the different ways that, you know, folks can show up in these anti-caste spaces. And I just kind of wanted to end with a new world is possible. It's already happening. And like having events like the Dreamlands, it is, you know, intentionally creating anti-caste spaces. And I will end the presentation with that. JB, thank you. Just gonna stop.
Thank you so much, Manu. I've learned so much just in this short time. We do have quite a few questions. If you're open to that, I can we can volley, we can have a little conversation.
Yeah,
A lot of
for
folks are sending applauses if you're seeing in hearts.
sure. I hope that folks did get things out of it. I do get nervous
Yeah.
when I'm presenting, but I hope that folks did learn something new.
You're
And then,
getting so much love in the hearts and everything in the chat. So I think people are really taking a lot from it. So yeah, thank you so much for your time, for your knowledge, your power, all of the things.
thank you.
For the questions, I think it might be best to stop the recording, but we'll still keep the chat going.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, I'm gonna stop the recording now.